Ch.72, to meet you in the mortal realm, to find flowers beneath the rain. After hearing what Mu King said, Si Lian paused briefly in his step, but he didn't turn back. He waved his hand and continued forward by himself. When he returned to the Xianlei capital, Si Lian first headed straight for the royal palace. He didn't know why he needed to go there, since it was not exactly to see his parents. It wasn't only because of the fact that, as a heavenly official, he was forbidden to reveal himself to his closest family members, but more so because, in the time he had left home and in the years that had passed, he didn't really know how to initiate conversation with his parents anymore. This was probably the same for every child in the world. Thus, he concealed himself and haphazardly ran about the palace he was so familiar with, but His Majesty the King was nowhere to be seen. Finally, when he came to Qifeng Manor, he found his father and mother. The two had just dismissed the palace servants and were chatting between themselves. The Queen sat on the side of the bed. The mask that she was fiddling around with in her hands was the very one that Si Lian had worn 3 years ago at the heavenly ceremonial procession. The shape of the golden mask was carefully molded with Si Lian's features, which was why it had fit him perfectly and comfortably when he had worn it. When it was seen by others, the degree of replication was almost frightening. The king chided from the side, "Stop playing around with that and come give me a head massage." Even though the king and the queen put up a front in front of the people, ever since Si Lian was little, he had seen clearly that behind the scenes, his parents would bicker like any other normal married couple. The queen put down the mask as expected and sat down by the king's side to help massage his temples. As she was combing through his hair, she suddenly said, "You've more white in your hair again." Si Lian took a closer look. True to his mother's words, the sides of his father's hair were graying, and it aged him a few years. He wondered to himself, didn't father visit the royal holy pavilion to pray just a while back? At the time, his hair was still black. How did it gray so suddenly? The queen handed a copper mirror to the king, but he pushed it away. "No need to see. Just dye it black again next time we go visit Mount Taikang." It was then that Si Lian realized, his hair didn't gray only recently. It grayed a long time ago, it's just that he dyed it black every time before coming to see me. Yet because I've been too occupied listening to the prayers of my devotees and running about, I rarely made time to come back and visit, which was why I didn't suspect anything. Coming to this conclusion, Si Lian was filled with guilt. For once, he was glad his parents weren't able to see him. As the queen massaged the king's head, she murmured, "I told you to rest early every day, yet you never listen to me and even say that I nag you day and night. Now look at how unseemly you've become. If our son saw you, he definitely wouldn't want anything to do with you." The king huffed. "Ever since your son grew up and his wings toughened, he stopped caring about me. Anyway, though he said it in such a manner, he still couldn't help but take a peek at the copper mirror by the bedside and muttered, "It's not that bad, isn't it? Still the same face." Si Lian was speechless. He never realized that his father had this side to him, talking bad about him behind his back with such petulant bitterness, and he couldn't help but smile. The queen laughed. Okay, it's not bad. Your health is more important than the heavens, you should
rest early today.
The king shook his head.
I can't rest right now.
Recently, there are a number of people from Yongan that
have arrived at the capital.
If they want to come, that's fine, but they've also stirred up trouble, making people feel uneasy.
It's a tricky situation.
It turns out that the reason behind his father's graying hair was because of the drought at Yongan. There was an unspeakable kind of misery in Si Lian's heart.
The queen nodded.
I heard from Rong-er that he met someone from Yongan today. He said that the man tried to steal money from the temple. How frightening. The king had a wary look in his eyes. Indeed, it's shocking. If there were only tens or hundreds of them, that would be fine, but if a couple 100,000 of them come and go rogue all over the capital, then who knows what's going to happen?
The queen debated for a while and finally said, that might not happen. If they follow the laws and keep to themselves, then let them come.
The king became agitated. As the king of a nation, how can I take a risk with something that might not happen? Besides, they definitely can't come over.
Looking after a few more people isn't as simple as placing a couple more sets of chopsticks down at the table.
There are many complications involved that you don't understand, so stop talking. The queen soothed. Okay, let's not talk about this anymore. I don't understand the things you spoke of to begin with anyway.
If only our son was still here.
Then he could at least help take some burden off of you.
The king scoffed.
Him. What can he do? As long as he doesn't cause me any more worries, then that's already good enough. At the mention of Si Lian, the king seemed to liven up again. That son of yours, he's already 10-something years old, but he was raised like a princess.
Even if he knew, it won't do any good, he'll just add
more problems to it. It's best if he stays carefree in the heavens without knowing anything.
Let him do
what he wants to do. He's not the crown prince anymore, there's no need for him to care about matters in the mortal realm.
Let him fly to his heart's content.
Si Lian listened silently as his father ranted with growing excitement.
With a knowing smile on her face,
the queen nudged the king. Now you call him a princess. Weren't you the one who spoiled our princess since he was young?
And now
you want to blame it all on me? She then sighed. That child is good at everything except for missing home.
Before, when he was studying at the Royal Holy Pavilion, he'd only come back to visit once every
few months.
Now that he ascended, it's even more difficult.
We haven't seen him once in 3 years.
Who
knows if we'll see him again? Hearing her complain, the king took Si Lian's side. How would a woman know anything?
The Guoshi said those were the laws of heaven. How can we treat him like a common mortal?
If you call your son back, you'd be weighing him down. The queen hurriedly explained herself, I'm only just saying. I won't make any such demands when we're in front of him. Then she muttered to herself, it's not too bad looking at the statues either, they look pretty much like him, and the statues are everywhere. Watching them for so long, Si Lian felt an ache in his heart and a hard lump lodged in his throat, making it painful for him to swallow. He couldn't stay hidden any longer, yet he couldn't reveal himself either. It wasn't because he was afraid of breaking heaven's laws, but rather, even now, he still didn't know what to say. As for the situation in Yongan, he didn't have any solution at the moment. If he were to suddenly appear, it would only cause his parents more agitation and stress. He dashed out of the royal palace. The moment he was outside, Si Lian took in a couple of deep breaths. And it was only then that he was finally able to calm down. He steadied his heart and pulled himself together. Thinking action was better than standing around sighing. He cast a spell and transformed himself
into a plainly dressed young cultivator.
He ran around the capital, digging for information and recorded
his findings. Traversing all over, after a full day of work, he finally got the answers he wanted.
Indeed, the water level in all the lakes and rivers within the royal capital of Xianlei was lower than the previous years. Back when he was still at the Royal Holy Pavilion, there were a few times when he'd snuck down the mountain to play.
As he rowed his boat happily along the largest river that crossed through the kingdom of Xianlei, the water level at that time was only just a tad short of the levee, yet now, it had
dropped several meters. On top of that, the residents of the city said it had been like that for a while. It wasn't something that happened overnight. Before this, Si Lian really hadn't paid much attention, but
now that he had, he was shocked to see all the warning signs.
He had originally hoped there'd be some mistake in Mu King's report and thus decided to come and see it for himself. But now he can't deny the
fact that Mu King had never let him down before.
Once the situation was confirmed, Si Lian stood solemnly by the riverside, deep in contemplation. Pedestrians passed behind from time to time, some nodded and smiled, others looked on curiously, but most went about happily minding their own business. An unknown amount of time passed, and quietly clouds gathered from the edge of the skies, sounds of pitter-patter filled the surroundings. It had started
to rain.
Numerous pedestrians on the street looked up to the sky. So unlucky. It's raining, let's hurry back. Yeah. How troublesome. Clip-clop clip-clop. Raindrops were beating down on Si Lian's face and clothes before he finally became
aware of his surroundings.
It's raining. When the people in the capital saw rain, they would drop everything to find shelter. Little did they know just how many were dying on the other side of Xianlei for a rainstorm like this to come. A group of people with umbrellas ran past, and when they saw Si Lian alone, getting soaked by the rain, they pulled him along and beckoned. Young cultivator, why aren't you getting out of this rain? It's coming down harder. Dazed, Si Lian followed along and ran to seek shelter under a long roof. Not soon after the group of people tucked away their umbrellas, they broke out in laughter. Luckily, I saw the clouds gather when I came out today and grabbed an umbrella, or else I would have really become a drowned rat. It's been too long since it last rained.
The storm is way overdue, so it's going to be a big one.
Gosh, see.
It really is coming down harder. At this rate, it's going to turn into a deluge. The raindrops were beating down on the ground, splattering outwards. Those people spoke in such a familiar accent that Si Lian felt deeply that this was his home. This was the place he was born and grew.
up, and those were the citizens he knew. As the chitter-chatter continued, the rain became a little lighter. A few people urged, while it's still light, we should hurry and go. Right after that, the men opened their umbrellas and stepped out from under the roof one after another. But Si Lian still stood where he was. A couple of them glanced back, and after a brief discussion among
themselves, one came over and handed him a worn-down umbrella.
He offered politely. Young cultivator, are you not able to return home?
This rain is quite heavy, why don't
you take this umbrella?
Si Lian snapped out of his daydream.
Thank you very much, but what about you?
A few people in the group under the rain called out, we still have a couple of umbrellas here that we can squeeze under together.
Let's go, let's go. Urged by his companions, the man left the umbrella in Si Lian's hand and ran back. The pa-pa sounds of
their footsteps slowly faded away in the distance as Si Lian stood for a while longer, holding on to the
umbrella. Suddenly, his eyes caught a glimpse of an inconspicuous shrine not too far away. He opened his umbrella and walked towards it in the rain.
Upon a closer look, the two sides of the small shrine doors
were written with the verses, body in abyss, heart in paradise. Turned out that this was a shrine of the Crown Prince. Since 8,000 temples were built within only the span of 3 years, it was only natural not every one of them would be as extravagant and breathtaking as the one on Mount Taikang.
Amongst the shrines,
there were quite a few that were built by amateurs to fill the number and generate the excitement. Not only did they lack a donation box, but they also didn't have any shrine priests. The only things that they
had were a clay statue, and a couple of offering plates filled with assorted fruits and refreshments. Those with kind hearts would come by once in a while to freshen the place a little, so that it could at least pass for a decent shrine. Well hidden in an area like this was such an inconspicuous shrine of the Crown Prince. Without stepping in, Si Lian could already make out what could be described as a charmingly tacky Crown Prince statue. Exquisite clothing, a pale, round face with a slightly pinkish undertone, and a silly smile.
The statue looked like a big doll.
If he didn't have so much on his mind, he probably would have laughed out loud.
In the past 3 years, Si Lian had seen 3,000, if not 5,000 Crown Prince statues.
There were none that looked exactly like himself. Even the most similar one was still 7 points off.
As for the rest, they were either too ugly or too beautiful. A majority of the divine statues of most other
heavenly officials were too ugly, and yet, Si Lian was the exact opposite.
There were some that were beautiful beyond recognition, to the point where he, himself, was embarrassed. He didn't really take a good look at this clay statue to begin with. His eyes had glossed over it quickly, but unexpectedly, a snow-white blur caught his eye and grabbed his attention.
Grasped in the left hand of that crudely made clay Crown Prince statue was a flower, white as snow.
The pearl-white petals, with crystal dew clinging onto them, looked beyond delicate. One could faintly
catch a wisp of its fragrance floating in the air, lovely and endearing.
The signature pose of the Crown Prince statue was sword in one hand, flower in the other. Said flower that was held in the left hand would, of course, be a finely crafted flower of gold, flower of gems, flower of jade.
However, this was the
First time Si Lian had seen a real flower clasped within his statue's hand, and he couldn't help but lean forward to get a better look.
After a close examination, he discovered that the Crown Prince statue had probably held a clay flower.
Once upon a time. Whether it fell due to the sculptor's poor skills or if someone had intentionally picked it off as some form of a prank, only a small hole remained in the left fist. That little white flower just so
happened to be placed in this hole. If there was a person that had especially picked a flower to fill the
empty space within this statue, then that person was truly kind-hearted. Si Lian's thoughts came to a halt when he heard a series of hurried footsteps. He didn't look back immediately, but instead hid his form. With the umbrella in hand, he lightly leapt onto the altar, and then
turned around to look down.
Within the grey fog of rain, a young boy barged in. This boy was no older than 12 or 13. His dirt-stained, patched clothes were soaked from head to toe, and his face was covered by filthy bandages. His right fist was tightly clutching onto his left, as if protecting something important. It was only after he had entered the shrine did he finally release his hands. A tiny, single flower, as white as snow, was sitting in his palms. Next chapter. Ch.73, to meet you in the mortal realm, to find flowers beneath the rain too. Si Lian made a small sound as if he had just remembered something in the back of his mind. The face that was wrapped under the layers of bandages inevitably reminded him of the child he had met 3 years ago. However, he wasn't completely sure. Pessimistically speaking, could that child still be alive 3 years after escaping from Mount Taikang? Just then, the young boy came forward. He lifted himself up on tippy toes and swapped the flower on the clay statue with the one he had in his hands.
From atop the altar, Si Lian could see it as clear as day. The
petals on this new flower were fuller and even more delicate. It carried twice as many dewdrops, and from the strong fragrance, one could be certain that it was freshly picked. Could it be that the sole reason for this boy to visit an inconspicuous shrine like this every day was just to replace the flower with a fresher one? Moreover, after offering the flower, the young boy stood in front of the clay prince statue. Unlike the others who stubbornly wanted to kneel, he interlocked his fingers, and silently made a prayer while standing. He had actually followed Si Lian's wishes. It had been 3 years. Among all of Si Lian's followers that had prayed, there were officials, nobles, names that traveled across this land, and talents that would even impress the heavens. Yet the one Si Lian felt was the most sincere was actually this child, who looked barely over 13. Furthermore, it was a child who had probably been kicked out of those fancier golden temples simply because of his patched clothing, and could only come to this kind of shabby, run-down shrine to offer his prayers. Truly, an indescribable sentiment. Just then, more sounds of wet footsteps came from outside the shrine. A group of children with umbrellas rowdily ran past. At first, Si Lian thought that they were only passing by, but unexpectedly, they circled back again. Acting like they discovered something extraordinary, one child clapped his hands. Wow, wow! The ugly monster got kicked out again.
even though the group of kids and the boy in the temple were all around the same age. Every one of them
was taller than him, and looked as if their parents had fed them well. There was probably a holiday coming up, as all of them were dressed in new clothes and new shoes. As they splashed around in the puddles playfully by the shrine entrance, their innocent smiles were full of life and void of any ill intent. It was as if they didn't really understand that ugly monster were awful words, and didn't think that their
own words would be hurtful. They probably thought that it was funny.
The boy tightened his fist, but his fist was so small that it wasn't threatening at all. The kids by the door teased. "Hey, ugly monster, you sleeping in the shrine again tonight?
Better watch
out, that mom of yours is gonna beat the living hell out of you when you get home." Si Lian frowned. Under the wrapped bandages, the boy's one eye flashed with anger.
He raised his fists and yelled,
"I don't have a home!" Exclamation mark. "I don't have a mom. She's not my mom. Get out. Get out. Keep talking and I'm gonna beat the crap out of you." Yet the group of kids couldn't care less.
They stuck out their tongues and challenged, "You dare?
Careful.
We might just tell your dad again, and let him teach you a lesson."
Some raised their brows and sneered. "Oh right, you don't have a mom, because your mom didn't want you. You don't have a home, because your family doesn't want anything to do with you. That's why you can only sleep in this pitiful shrine."
The young boy couldn't endure it any longer.
With a loud cry, he lunged at them. For such a scrawny kid, he sure could pack a punch. The loud cry had almost sent a couple of the kids
running in fear, but the kid that had originally started the fight held his ground.
"What's there to be scared of?" Exclamation mark. "We have more people."
Upon hearing that, the ones who wanted to run away returned and joined the fight, pulling at the boys'
hands and feet.
Si Lian finally couldn't stand it anymore. With a wave of his hand, an invisible force shot
out of the blue and separated the boys. Immediately after, a powerful wave of puddle water flew up from the ground and knocked the group of children off their feet. In the end, they were still kids. After falling to the ground without knowing why and getting a whole
mouthful of muddy water, their new clothes were completely soaked. Now that they'd become even filthier
and uglier than the kid they made fun of, the happy laughter from before was replaced with loud wailing. They crawled up from the ground and ran away sniffling with umbrellas in their hands. Si Lian shook his head in disappointment. As a proper martial god whose job was to ward off evil ghosts and bring protection and peace, this was the first time that he'd gotten tangled in this kind of juvenile
dispute.
Even though he had chased away the wrongdoers, he didn't feel accomplished at all.
His gaze
returned to the young boy. During that chaos, the bandages on the boy's head had been yanked off halfway. The half-revealed face
was swollen with blue and purple bruises.
It was obvious that these hadn't been caused by the brawl just now. Before Si Lian could get a better look, the boy had already rewrapped his bandages without a word. He sat down by the clay statue's feet and hugged his knees close. Si Lian had originally wanted to come to this crown prince shrine to think.
He had planned on summoning Feng Xin and Mu King to discuss an important matter, but the child that he had unexpectedly bumped into had drawn his attention.
He sent out a summoning, then squatted down beside the boy and stared. Not long after, a rumbling sound came from the boy's stomach. The offering plate still had a couple of fruits and sweets. Although they looked dried out and probably wouldn't taste that good, it was better than nothing.
Si Lian picked one and lightly tossed it towards the boy. Having gotten hit by the fruit, the young boy immediately wrapped his arms around his head and curled up defensively, as if the thing that hit him was a rock, and that it would be followed by more. After a while,
he finally looked around and realized it was only a fruit, and that there wasn't anyone nearby.
Hesitantly, he picked up the fruit, dusted it off twice against his clothes, and returned it to the offering plate.
Turns out he would rather endure the hunger than eat the offerings on the plate.
After that, he walked towards the door, and looked at the heavy downpour outside of the shrine as if
debating whether to venture out to find food. However, the rain was coming down too hard. Since he didn't want to get soaked again, he walked back and curled up on the ground by the clay statue's feet. Just then, Feng Xin and Mu King arrived after receiving the call.
The two stepped out from behind the
shrine. Feng Xin gloomily said, "Your Highness, how did you find such a small crown prince shrine?
Why did you
send out a call from here?" When he looked down, he suddenly noticed a curled-up figure on the ground
that he could have almost stepped on unknowingly, and blurted out, "What the hell is this kid doing here?"
Mu King also looked down, took a good look and immediately asked, "Your Highness, is this the child that ran from Mount Taikang 3 years ago?" Si Lian shook his head. "I'm not sure. I didn't know what his name was nor what he looked like." As the three surrounded the unsuspecting child and chatted, the boy on the ground shifted. As he wiped his face, Si Lian realized there was blood running down his nose and the corner of his mouth.
Seeing this, Si Lian felt he couldn't just do nothing. He said, "Let this child leave first.
It's getting dark. This shrine isn't a good place to pass the night. Could it be that he has nowhere to go? If that's the case, then I'm afraid this is the only place that he could spend the night in," Feng Xin said.
"He has a home, though the situation there might not be great," Si Lian said.
"Even so, this shrine isn't any better. If he leaves, then we can find something for him to eat."
"He's also injured."
Mu King spoke up, "Your Highness, please excuse my frankness, but we don't have time to bother with these minor things."
"Did you call us here because you've come to a decision?"
Of all the heavenly officials who resided in the upper court, there had never been one that would accept every prayer from all of the devotees. With countless amounts of followers, if one was to care for every single one of them, it would be exhausting. Which was why, sometimes, they would turn a blind eye to those minor and less impactful wishes, and pretend that they didn't hear, to lessen the workload. Maybe it
was due to Si Lian's young age, with a body bursting with energy and passion, that he had yet to learn
about how to properly prioritize and work those things out. After some thought, he walked towards the entrance of the tiny shrine while carrying the umbrella that was gifted to him earlier by those pedestrians. On the street, Si Lian slowly opened the umbrella. The falling raindrops beat down on it, creating a pitter-patter sound. On the ground, the young boy heard the noise and thought that someone had entered and shifted slightly. But, after thinking no one would really bother with him, he laid back down again.
Si Lian placed the
opened umbrella by the entrance. The young boy waited for the sound to disappear, but when it didn't, he sat up in suspicion to take a look.
When he saw a red umbrella leaning against the ground under the rain,
like a lonely crimson flower that had bloomed by itself, he froze in surprise. Watching the boy rushing forward to grab the umbrella, Mu King lectured, "Your Highness, you've done more than enough here. If you're too obvious and he finds out, it would be troublesome."
Before Si Lian could reply, the young boy ran back and shouted from behind them, "Your Highness."
The three gods almost jumped in surprise and turned around. That boy, cradling the umbrella in his arms, had an eye that was reddened and filled with emotion. He lifted his head and shouted to the clay statue, "Your Highness, is that you?" Exclamation mark. Feng Xin didn't know Si Lian helped the boy chase away the other group of kids and had even chucked a
fruit at him prior to this.
He mused, "This kid is quite clever, he actually figured it out." Mu King, on the other hand, suspected that something must have happened before, and eyed Si Lian. The boy begged, "If you're here, please, answer my one question." From his place high atop the altar, Si Lian would hear countless pleas of "Please appear before me." Every day. When a sound becomes repetitive, it would numb the ear and eventually fade into the background. Even so, whenever he heard a voice like this, he couldn't help but drop matters at hand and perk up his ears. From his side, Mu King cautioned, "Your Highness, just leave it be." Si Lian didn't speak.
The young boy clutched onto the umbrella tightly with both hands, gritting his
teeth.
"I'm suffering.
Every day, I wish I'd die. Every day, I want to kill off everyone in this world, and then kill myself. I'm living in agony." From a boy that couldn't be older than 13, shouting words like "suffering" and "kill off everyone" sounded almost ridiculous and laughable. However, hidden inside this tiny body was something explosive.
Something that nurtured his rage and roars.
Feng Xin scoffed, "What's wrong with him? Kill everyone in this world, is that something a kid could say?" Mu King said flatly, "He's still young. When he gets older, he'll know that what he experiences now is
really nothing much." After a pause he looked at Si Lian.
"There are too many suffering in this world.
Take Yonggan's drought, for example. Name one Yonggan citizen that has it better than him. There's no
need to bother with this, Your Highness.
Let's focus on our priorities."
Si Lian said softly, "Perhaps to another, the suffering of one probably only looked like trivial problems." The boy was still looking up at the statue. His eye was becoming even redder, yet there were no tears. With the umbrella in one hand, he reached out with the other and tugged on the clay statue's robes.
He persisted, "For what should I live for in this world?
What does it mean to live?" However, his questions were met by silence, not a soul to give him answers. It seemed that the young boy had expected as much and, slowly, dropped his head. To his surprise, suddenly, a voice from above broke through the dead silence, "If you don't know how to
live on anymore, then live for me.
Next to Si Lian, both Feng Xin and Mu King had not expected him to actually answer, and Sichan. Answer 2. Their eyes widened. Your Highness! Exclamation mark. The young boy's head shot up, but there was no one there.
Only a soft and gentle voice came from that
clay statue.
I have no answer to the question you asked.
However, if you don't know the meaning of your life, then make me that meaning, and use me as your reason to live. Feng Xin and Mu King's faces looked as if they were about to explode, and both reached out their hands
to smother Si Lian's mouth, sputtering, "No more, Your Highness.
You're violating the rules."
The rules!
Exclamation mark. But before they could fully cover up his mouth, Si Lian managed to shout out, "Thank you for your flower.
It's beautiful. I like it very much."